All right, let's dive in. This time, we're tackling a story that's been told and retold for centuries, the Pilgrim's Journey to America. But we're going beyond the Thanksgiving myths and uncovering the complexities, the nuances that make this story so much richer than the simple version we often hear.
Absolutely. We'll trace their path from England to the Netherlands and back again, culminating in that famous voyage on the Mayflower.
It's mind-boggling to think over 30 million Americans today can trace their ancestry back to those 102 passengers. A pretty incredible legacy. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's break down who these pilgrims actually were.
Well, the name Pilgrim, that's not what they called themselves. They actually referred to themselves as saints, part of a larger group known as the separatists.
Saints and separatists. Okay, sounds pretty serious.
Yeah,
So what were they separating from, and why was it such a big deal back then?
they wanted to break away from the Church of England. They believed it had strayed too far from true Christianity. Their goal was to create their own independent congregations, free from any outside influence or control.
So they were like religious rebels. But wasn't that a pretty dangerous move in the 17th century, defying the king and all that?
It was incredibly risky. King James I held immense power, not just as head of state, but also head of the church. Defying him could mean fines, imprisonment, even death.
Wow, they were really putting it all on the line for their beliefs. What was life like in England that made them so desperate for change?
England in the early 1600s, not a great time. It was a tumultuous period. Plagues, poor harvests, social unrest. Life was hard.
I can only imagine to be dealing with those hardships on top of religious persecution. So eventually they set their sights on Holland, Amsterdam specifically. What was it about Holland that appealed to them?
Amsterdam had a reputation for tolerance, especially religious tolerance. It was this global hub for trade where people from all walks of life coexisted. And there's actually an interesting connection here. William Brewster, one of the prominent pilgrims, had spent time in Amsterdam and had seen firsthand the freedoms it offered.
So it was like a beacon of hope for them, a potential safe haven. But they didn't stay in Amsterdam, did they? They ended up moving on to Leiden. Why was that?
Their escape to Amsterdam was already pretty dramatic, full of secret departures and near captures. They were fleeing illegally, remember? But even once they settled in Amsterdam, it wasn't quite the perfect fit.
What kind of challenges did they face? Even in a place known for tolerance, I imagine integrating into a new culture wouldn't be easy.
Yeah, they had trouble adapting to Dutch customs, faced some cultural clashes. It's actually a bit of a paradox when you think about it. This group that was so desperate for religious freedom, they struggled to accept practices that were different from their own.
That's a fascinating point. Seems to be a recurring theme throughout history, doesn't it? Even those seeking freedom can have a hard time embracing those who are different. So they moved to Leiden, a quieter university town, hoping for a more peaceful existence. But eventually they decided to leave Holland altogether. What prompted that decision?
Well, the looming threat of war with Spain, a Catholic power, was a major concern. They also worried about their children losing their English identity and wanted to raise them in a more familiar setting.
So they were caught between a rock and a hard place. And at the same time, you have this whole new world being discovered across the Atlantic. What did they really know about America at the time? It must have seemed like such a wild and dangerous gamble.
Information was pretty limited, but they'd heard stories, read reports from explorers. They knew it was risky, but they also saw it as a chance for a fresh start. To own land, build a community based on their values, and practice their faith without fear.
And of course, we can't forget the role of faith in all this. They truly believed God would guide and protect them, which must have been a source of comfort in the face of such uncertainty.
Oh, absolutely. Their belief in divine providence was a driving force. It gave them the courage to embark on such a monumental journey. But their motives weren't entirely spiritual either.
You're right, there was a practical element too. The Virginia Company, an English trading company, was offering land and opportunities for settlement in the New World.
Exactly. The Pilgrims saw this as a chance to improve their economic situation and create a self-sustaining community. And this is where their story intersects with the broader historical context of colonialism. They were seeking religious freedom, yes, but they were also participating in a movement driven by economic ambition and territorial expansion.
So it was this complex mix of motivations, faith, fear, the lure of a new beginning, and so they began preparing for this epic voyage. And this is where the Speedwell and the Mayflower, two ships that would become central to their story, enter the picture.
Right. They purchased the Speedwell to transport the Leyden congregation. The Mayflower was hired specifically for the transatlantic crossing, and here it's crucial to understand the role of the merchant
The
adventurers.
merchant adventurers, they were the financial backers, right? What was the arrangement they had with the Pilgrims?
It wasn't a free ride, that's for sure. The Pilgrims were essentially indentured servants. They signed a 7-year contract, pledging to work and repay the debt they incurred for the voyage and the establishment of their colony.
So it wasn't just a free ticket to a new life. They were bound by some pretty strict terms. This definitely paints a different picture from the romanticized version we often hear. Before we move on to the actual voyage, I'm curious about the nitty-gritty details. What kind of provisions did they pack? What were their anxieties as they prepared to leave? And what hopes did they carry with them?
Picture this: barrels of salted meat and dried fish, stacks of hardtack, that kind of biscuit, cheese, beer, and of course, water. They packed clothing, tools, and their cherished books. Those books really show how important education and faith were to them, even in the face of such hardship. As for what they expected in the New World, well, they had maps, some reports from explorers, and a lot of hope. But the reality, as we know, turned out to be very different.
And of course, they landed much farther north than intended. They aimed for Virginia, but ended up in what's now Massachusetts. What led to that significant change in course?
A few things, actually: storms, navigational errors, and probably some disagreements among the leaders about the best way forward. They finally dropped anchor in Cape Cod Bay in November of 1620. Can you imagine that mix of relief and trepidation? Finally sighting land after so long at sea?
It must have been such an intense moment. Gratitude for surviving the journey, awe at this new land, and undoubtedly some fear of the unknown. So what happened next? They didn't just disembark and start building houses, right?
Not quite. They spent weeks exploring the coastline, searching for the best spot to settle. And this is where a pivotal moment unfolds: the creation of the Mayflower Compact.
And the Mayflower Compact, often cited as this cornerstone of American democracy.
Yeah.
Why is it so significant?
Well, they realized they were outside the jurisdiction of the Virginia Company, their original sponsor. They needed to establish their own government, their own rules for this new society they were creating. The Mayflower Compact wasn't a constitution in the modern sense, but it did lay out some key principles. They agreed to form a civil body politic, basically a self-governing community, and to create just and equal laws for the good of the colony.
So they were literally crafting a new society from scratch. They ultimately chose Plymouth as their settlement site, but winter was fast approaching. What were some of the challenges they faced trying to build a life in this new land, especially as the weather turned harsh?
The winter of 1620-1621 was brutal. They lacked proper shelter, food supplies dwindled, and disease ran rampant through the colony. Nearly half of the Mayflower passengers perished during those first few months.
That's heartbreaking. It really underscores how precarious their existence was. What factors helped them persevere through such unimaginable hardship?
Their faith and their strong sense of community were absolutely crucial. They relied on each other for support, and their belief in God's plan gave them hope even in the darkest of times. They also received vital help from the indigenous people who already lived in the region, the Wampanoag tribe.
This brings us to the part of the story that's often emphasized: the Thanksgiving feast. But the relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, I imagine it was far more complicated than a simple shared meal. What were the real dynamics at play?
You're right to question that simple narrative. It was a very complex relationship shaped by cooperation but also tension. The Wampanoag had their own reasons for interacting with these newcomers. They had been weakened by diseases brought by earlier European explorers and saw the Pilgrims as potential allies against rival tribes.
So there were strategic considerations on both sides. It wasn't just about sharing a friendly meal. It was about survival, navigating a rapidly changing world, and forging alliances.
Exactly. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims essential survival skills: how to cultivate the land, how to fish, how to hunt. The harvest feast in the fall of 1621, which lasted for 3 days and involved feasting and games, that represents a moment of shared celebration and cultural exchange. But it's important to remember that was just one moment in a much longer and more intricate story.
A story that, as we'll see in our next part, had far-reaching consequences for both the Pilgrims and the indigenous people whose lives were forever altered by their arrival. Welcome back to our deep dive into the Pilgrims' journey. Last time we left off, they were facing a major setback. The Speedwell, their own ship, turned out to be unseaworthy.
Right, it couldn't make the voyage.
Had to cram onto the already crowded Mayflower, making a tough journey even tougher.
Imagine the disappointment, the uncertainty. They come so far, overcome so much, leaving their homes, facing persecution, starting over in a foreign land, and now this.
It's hard to grasp the resilience it must have taken to keep pushing forward. What do you think kept them going in the face of all that?
Their faith was huge. They saw these setbacks as trials, sent from God, tests of their commitment. And practically speaking, they had invested everything in this venture. Turning back just wasn't an option at that point.
So on September 6, 1620, they finally set sail from Plymouth, England. 102 passengers, a crew of about 30, all packed onto that one ship. 66 days at sea, I can't even imagine.
It's hard for us to really get what it was like. Weeks and weeks tossed around by storms, seasickness everywhere, dwindling supplies, the constant fear of disease. And remember, a lot of those passengers, they weren't seasoned sailors. Farmers, tradespeople, families with young children.
It's incredible the scope of what they faced. I know they brought provisions for the journey, but what did that actually consist of? And did they have any real idea what awaited them on the other side?
They packed what they could to last. Salted meat, dried fish, hardtack, that biscuit-like bread, cheese, beer, water, also tools, seeds, clothing, and those books we mentioned, remember? The books really highlight how much they valued education and faith, even going through all that. As for what they expected to find in the New World, maps, some reports from explorers, and a lot of hope. But the reality was a bit different.
Yeah, they landed way farther north than planned, aiming for Virginia, ended up in what's now Massachusetts. What happened there? What caused that change in course?
It was a few things, actually. Storms, navigational errors, and most likely disagreements among the leaders about the best route. They finally dropped anchor in Cape Cod Bay in November of 1620. Can you picture the feeling, the relief, the uncertainty, finally seeing land after so long?
It must have been a moment of such intense emotion. Gratitude for surviving, awe of the new land, and definitely some fear of what lay ahead. So what then?
Right.
They didn't just step off and start building.
All right. Not exactly. They spent weeks exploring, looking for the right place to settle. And here's where a crucial moment happens. The creation of the Mayflower Compact.
The Mayflower Compact. That document that's always brought up as a foundation of American democracy. What makes it so important?
Well, they realized they were outside the Virginia Company's jurisdiction, their original sponsor. They needed to establish their own government rules for this new society. The Mayflower Compact, it wasn't a constitution like we think of today, but it did establish some key principles. They agreed to form a civil body politic, a self-governing community, and create just and equal laws for the colony's good.
They were really building a new society from the ground up. They chose Plymouth, but winter was coming in fast. What challenges did they face building a life there, especially with the weather getting harsh?
That first winter, 1620, 1621, was brutal. They didn't have adequate shelter, food was scarce, and disease spread through the colony. Almost half the Mayflower passengers died in those first few months.
Heartbreaking.
Yeah.
Really shows how fragile their situation was, what got them through that.
Their faith and their community, they relied on each other, and their belief in God's plan kept them going, even in the darkest times. And let's not forget, they got some crucial help from the indigenous people living there, the Wampanoag tribe.
Right, which brings us to the often told story, the Thanksgiving feast. But I imagine the reality of the Pilgrims' relationship with the Wampanoag was far more complicated.
Definitely. It was a complex relationship, a mix of cooperation and tension. The Wampanoag, they had their own reasons for interacting with these new arrivals.
What were those?
Well, they had been weakened by diseases from earlier European contact, remember? They saw the Pilgrims as potential allies, against rival tribes.
Ah, so both sides had their own agendas.
Right.
It wasn't just about a friendly meal. It was about survival in a changing world and forming alliances in the face of uncertainty.
Precisely. The Wampanoag taught the Pilgrims essential survival skills, how to cultivate the land, fish, and hunt. The harvest feast that fall, the one in 1621, that lasted for 3 days, with all the feasting and games, that does represent a moment of shared celebration, cultural exchange. But it's key to remember that was just one moment in a much longer and more complicated story.
A story that, as we'll see in the final part of our deep dive, had long-lasting consequences for both the Pilgrims and the native people whose lives changed forever when they arrived. We're back for the final chapter of our deep dive into the Pilgrims' journey. We followed them from England to Holland and across the Atlantic to the shores of this new world. But their arrival in Plymouth, that was really just the beginning of a whole other story.
Definitely not the end. The Plymouth colony, they faced so many obstacles. Conflicts with native tribes, tough weather, disagreements within the colony, and always that struggle to make the land produce enough to survive.
So that image of a new Jerusalem they had, that didn't last long once they had to face the realities of this new environment.
You got it. And remember, they weren't alone in this new world. Their arrival had a huge impact on the indigenous people who'd been there for centuries.
That's a point we need to dig into more. How did the Pilgrims' quest for, you know, their own religious freedom, their desire for a new life, how did that affect the native people who were already here? We hear about the first Thanksgiving, the cooperation at the beginning, but I have a feeling it's not that simple.
You're right to question that narrative. The relationship between the Pilgrims and the Wampanoag, it was a lot more complicated. Yes, they cooperated at first for mutual benefit, but their values, their worldviews, those were very different.
What were some of those differences? The ones that ultimately led to conflict?
Land ownership was a big one. The Pilgrims, coming from Europe, they saw land as something to be owned, controlled, used for profit. The Wampanoag, they had a more communal view, more spiritual. They saw themselves as stewards of the land, not owners.
So even while they were sharing that harvest feast in 1621, the seeds of conflict were already there. Did these different views on land eventually lead to violence?
Sadly, they did. As Plymouth Colony grew, it took up more and more Wampanoag territory. That led to disputes over land rights, over resources. The Pilgrims, they needed more and more land, and that clashed with the Wampanoag way of life.
And this clash of cultures, of values, that's what led to those devastating wars, right?
Tragically, yes. The Pequot War in the 1630s and then King Philip's War in the 1670s. Brutal conflicts, thousands of people killed on both sides. These wars, they decimated native populations, changed the balance of power completely.
It's a stark reminder that one group's freedom can come at a terrible cost for others. How did the Pilgrims justify their actions, the violence, the displacement they inflicted on the indigenous people? How did they square that with their faith?
It's a question historians still debate. The Pilgrims, with their beliefs, they saw themselves as God's chosen people. They thought they were bringing civilization, Christianity, to what they saw as a savage land.
So they created this narrative to justify their actions, even when those actions went against their own ideals of peace and religious freedom.
Yeah, it's something we see throughout history. Even people who've been persecuted, they can become the persecutors. Human history, it's complicated, full of contradictions.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the Pilgrim's journey, what are some things we should remember?
The biggest lesson, I think, is to look beyond the simple stories. History's complex. The Pilgrim story, it's not just Thanksgiving and the birth of a nation. It's also about cultural clashes, the tragic effects of colonialism, and the fight for justice and understanding, which continues today.
It makes us examine our own beliefs, our own biases, face the difficult parts of the past, and try to build a better future.
Exactly. Their legacy is still with us, not just in the nation that came from their colony, but in the conversations we're having today about religious freedom, about cultural understanding, and the rights of indigenous people.
The Pilgrim's journey, even with all its complexities and contradictions, it reminds us that history isn't just about dates and events. It's about people, their choices, and the impact those choices have on others. It leaves us with something to think about. The Pilgrims were looking for religious freedom, but what does true religious freedom really mean? Is it just for one group? Or does it mean respecting the beliefs and practices of everyone, even those who are different from us? That's a question worth considering, especially today as we face our own challenges.